But the point is, the phone call is made to the next of kin only. I was stunned when I came to work yesterday morning and brokenhearted at what I saw a member of Congress doing. A member of Congress who listened in on a phone call from the President of the United States to a young wife. It stuns me that a member of Congress would have listened in on that conversation. Absolutely stuns me.
This man is a sick man. He's cold-hearted and he feels no pity or sympathy for anyone. He knew what he was signing up for, but it still hurt.
I think it is appalling what the Congresswoman has done and the way that she's politicized this issue and the way that she is trying to make this about something that it isn't. This was a president who loves our country very much, who has the greatest level of respect for men and women in the uniform, and wanted to call and offer condolences to the family. And I think to try to create something from that the Congresswoman is doing is frankly appalling and disgusting.
You mean to tell me that I have become so important that the White House is following me and my words? This is amazing. That's amazing. That is absolutely phenomenal. I have to tell my kids that I'm a rock star now.
In April of 2015, and a Congresswoman stood up, and in the long tradition of empty barrels making the most noise, stood up there and all of that, and talked about how she was instrumental in getting the funding for that building, and how she took care of her constituents because she got the money, and she just called up President Obama, and on that phone call, he gave the money, the $20 million to build the building. And she sat down, and we were stunned that she'd done it. Even for someone that is that empty a barrel, we were stunned. But none of us went to the press and criticized. None of us stood up and were appalled.
And that's a lie. But he can't just go on TV and lie on me. I was not even in Congress in 2009 when the money for the building was secured.
Well, his point was, I think, that empty barrels make the most noise.
That's a racist term, too. I'm thinking about that. We looked it up in the dictionary because I had never heard of an empty barrel.
Who are these young men and women? They are the best 1% this country produces. Most of you, as Americans, don't know them. Many of you don't know anyone who knows any one of them. But they are the very best this country produces. And they volunteer to protect our country when there's nothing in our country anymore that seems to suggest that selfless service to the nation is not only appropriate but required. But that's all right. Who writes letters to the families? Typically the company commander, Secretary of Defense, typically the service chief, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and the President typically writes a letter. Typically the only phone calls the family receives are the most important phone calls they can imagine, and that is from their buddies. In my case, hours after my son was killed, his friends were calling us from Afghanistan, telling us what a great guy he was. Those are the only phone calls that really matter. The letters count to a degree, but there's not much that really can take the edge off what a family member is going through. Some presidents have elected to call. All presidents, I believe, have elected to send letters. If you elect to call a family like this, it is about the most difficult thing you could imagine. There's no perfect way to make that phone call. When I took this job, talked to President Trump about how to do it, my first recommendation was he not do it, because it's not the phone call that parents, family members are looking forward to. It's nice to do, in my opinion, in any event. He asked me about previous presidents, and I said I can tell you that President Obama, who was my commander-in-chief when I was on active duty, did not call my family. That was not a criticism. That was just to simply say, I don't believe President Obama called. That's not a negative thing. I don't believe President Bush called in all cases. I don't believe any president, particularly when the casualty rates are very, very high, that presidents call. So when I gave that explanation to our president, he elected to make phone calls in the case of the 4 young men who we lost in Niger at the earlier part of this month. But then he said, how do you make these calls? If you're not in the family, if you've never worn the uniform, you've never been in combat, you can't even imagine how to make that call. I think he very bravely does make those calls. Call in question that he made yesterday. And remember, there's a next of kin designated by the individual. If he's married, that's typically the spouse. If he's not married, that's typically the parents. If he didn't get along with his parents, he'll select a sibling. But the point is, the phone call is made to the next of kin only if the next of kin agrees to take the phone call. Sometimes they don't. So a pre-call is made. President of the United States or the Commandant of the Marine Corps or someone would like to call. Will you accept the call? Typically, they all accept the call. So he called 4 people the other day and expressed his condolences in the best way that he could. And he said to me, what do I say? I said to him, sir, there's nothing you can do to lighten the burden on these families. Let me tell you what my best friend, Joe Dunford, told me, because he was my casualty officer. He said, Kel, he was doing exactly what he wanted to do when he was killed. He knew what he was getting into by joining that 1%. He knew what the possibilities were because we're at war. And when he died, in the 4 cases we're talking about, Niger, my son's case in Afghanistan, when he died, he was surrounded by the best men on this earth, his friends. That's what the president tried to say to 4 families the other day. I was stunned when I came to work yesterday morning and brokenhearted at what I saw a member of Congress doing. A member of Congress who listened in on a phone call from the President of the United States to a young wife, and in his way tried to express that opinion. He's a brave man, a fallen hero. He knew what he was getting himself into because he enlisted. There's no reason to enlist. He enlisted, and he was where he wanted to be, exactly where he wanted to be, with exactly the people he wanted to be with when his life was taken. That was the message. That was the message that was transmitted. It stuns me that a member of Congress would have listened in on that conversation. Absolutely stuns me. And I thought at least that was sacred. You know, when I was a kid growing up, a lot of things were sacred in our country. Women were sacred and looked upon with great honor. That's obviously not the case anymore, as we see from recent cases. Life, the dignity of life, was sacred. That's gone. Religion, that seems to be gone as well. Gold Star families, I think that left in the convention over the summer. But I just thought the selfless devotion that brings a man or woman to die on the battlefield, I just thought that that might be sacred. And when I listened to this woman and what she was saying and what she was doing on TV, the only thing I could do to collect my thoughts was to go walk among the finest men and women on this earth. And you can always find them because they're in Arlington National Cemetery. I went over there for an hour and a half, walked among the stones, some of whom I put there because they were doing what I told them to do when they were killed. I'll end with this. In April of 2015, I was still on active duty, and I went to the dedication of the new FBI field office in Miami. It was dedicated to 2 men who were killed in a firefight in Miami against drug traffickers in 1986. A guy by the name of Grogan and Duke. Grogan almost retired, 53 years old. Duke, I think less than a year on the job. Anyways, they got in a gunfight and they were killed. 3 other FBI agents were there, were wounded, now retired. So we go down, Jim Comey did an absolutely brilliant memorial speech to those fallen men, to all of the men and women of the FBI who serve our country so well. There were family members there. Some of the children that were there were only 3 or 4 years old when their dads were killed. 3 of the men that survived the fight were there and gave a rendition of how brave those men were and how they gave their lives. And a congresswoman stood up, and in the long tradition of empty barrels making the most noise, stood up there and all of that and talked about how she was instrumental in getting the funding for that building and how she took care of her constituents because she got the money, and she just called up President Obama, and on that phone call he gave the money, the $20 million to build the building. And she sat down, and we were stunned that she'd done it. Even for someone that is that empty a barrel, we were stunned. But you know, none of us went to the press and criticized. None of us stood up and were appalled. We just said, okay, fine. And I appeal to America. Let's not let this maybe last thing that's held sacred in our society, a young man, young woman going out and giving his or her life for our country. Let's try to somehow keep that sacred. But it eroded a great deal yesterday by the selfish behavior of a member of Congress.